Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 73, and today we're going to be asking who exactly were Jesus' brothers and sisters. Back in episode 51 of the NT Pod in 2011, that's good 3 years ago now, I asked what on earth we could know about the brothers of Jesus, and in the previous episode to that I looked at the even more difficult subject of Jesus' sisters, because we know even less about them. But I suggested that they have a surprising prominence in the early Christian movement. I mean, Jesus' brother James is apparently running the show in Jerusalem. When you look at Galatians 1 and 2, Paul visits Jerusalem, first 3 years after his conversion and then another 14 years later. And on both occasions, James is clearly a very important figure in the early Christian movement. And then you skip over to 1 Corinthians 9:5 and you see that the brothers of Jesus are active on mission. And it's curious because there's a contrast with the Gospels where at best, we have a kind of negative take on the brothers of Jesus. So you look at Mark 3:31 to 35, and you get this story that has the family of Jesus coming to see Jesus in Capernaum, presumably, and they're worried that he's gone mad. And then Jesus responds by saying, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Which is not exactly a kind of ringing endorsement of his family members. So there's a curious dynamic going on there between Paul and the Gospels. And it sets up one of the great enigmas in the studying of early Christianity. But I made a promise back then, to which I want to return now. And back then, I said that I would return at some point to ask the question, who actually are the brothers and sisters of Jesus? What is their relation to Jesus? And it's taken a few years to get back to that question. And the occasion is another snowcast. Today I was all ready to go and chat about the family of Jesus in my Historical Jesus class, which meets today. I mean, I'm recording this on March the 3rd, 2014, and we'd got to the bit of the course where we look at Jesus' family and we look at what we can find out about Jesus' origins, his early years, whatever. It's all very, very difficult, but it's a very important part of the study of the Historical Jesus to work out some of that background. And yet again, we got hit by the weather and classes that do it were cancelled. And so since I've podcasted quite a bit about things like the family of Jesus, I did revisit those old podcasts. I never normally listen to them back, but I wanted to find out what I'd actually said because I'd forgotten. And it turns out I did make that promise, so I apologise it's taken 3 years to fulfil it. And so today what I want to ask is who are the brothers and sisters of Jesus? What exactly is their relationship to Jesus? The question emerges from the fact that I know whenever I teach this topic, inevitably, eventually, if I don't say anything, somebody will put their hand up and say, well, how come brothers and sisters? How can it be that Jesus had brothers and sisters? If Mary was the perpetual virgin, blessed mother of Jesus, then how can Jesus have had brothers and sisters? Who are these people? So there's a difficulty for some people's doctrine on this, and especially, I suppose, for Catholic doctrine in which the perpetual virginity of the Virgin Mary has been underlined. Now, of course, the NT Pod takes a historical view on these things, and so I'm not going to be looking at later centuries and how they worked out these issues theologically, but I do want to look at what actually we can find out by looking at the earlier source material. And this will involve degrees of speculation, degrees of imagination, but I want to ground it in what the texts actually say. And I suppose the key question here is, are they actually Jesus' blood brothers and sisters? Are they his natural brothers and sisters? Or are they something else like his cousins? Or are they children from Joseph's previous marriage? Who are these people? Are they Jesus' brothers and sisters in the normally accepted sense of the term, brothers and sisters that we know? The cousins view, the idea that people like James, Joseph, Judas and Simon were Jesus' cousins, actually has a sort of degree of plausibility when you first hear it. I mean, even today in many cultures, people will talk about their brothers when they're referring to any member of the wider family. I had a friend at school who was from Pakistan, and he would regularly talk about his brother, meaning what I would call his uncle. It was his father's brother. So that is something which we're very familiar with in cultures today. Is that what's going on in the New Testament? I don't think so. It's a difficult one to get any purchase on. I mean, one of the problems is that the New Testament has got perfectly good words for cousin. For example, in Colossians 4:10, Barnabas and John Mark are described as cousins using the Greek word anepsios. So that does suggest that if the authors of the Gospels, if Paul had wanted to specify what the exact relationship was, they could have used a word like anepsios, or they could have used another word, kinsperson, sungenis in Greek. And that's the word which is used when you have Mary and Elizabeth getting together in Luke chapter 1 and verse 36. So that term could have been used as well. There were perfectly good terms in Greek that the Gospel writers and Paul could have used if they wanted to talk about the brothers and sisters of Jesus as being cousins. It's therefore relatively unlikely that we're looking at cousins here. It's also unlikely that we're looking at a kind of metaphorical use of the term brothers. Certainly in the Gospels that wouldn't make any sense at all to talk about brothers and sisters in that kind of metaphorical sense. The whole point of passages like the one, who is my mother, who are my brothers, is that you're taking literal family members and then extending that metaphorically to people that do the will of God. So clearly in the Gospels, the brothers and sisters are supposed to be blood brothers and sisters. What about Paul's epistles? In Paul's epistles, it does seem to be the case that James and the other brothers are regarded as actual blood brothers, as family members, because he uses this term brothers of the Lord, and it's not part of Paul's usage to describe average Christian punters in that way. Average Christians, he talks about as brothers and sisters, but he doesn't use that specific reference about brothers of the Lord. So it's unlikely that when you're using when they're using this terminology, that they're using terminology which is transferred, which is metaphorical. Which brings us back then to the thing again of the most likely option being that James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, who are listed according to those names in Mark 6:3, are the blood brothers of Jesus, the real flesh and blood relatives of Jesus. That's what we would assume, I'm pretty sure, if there weren't theological factors that are kind of influencing the way that we read the texts. And if it wasn't for that, I think we probably just would have left this question here. We never asked the question about whether or not James and John, the sons of Zebedee, are real brothers. We just take that kind of thing for granted. We don't ask the question about Mary and Martha in Luke 10 or in John 11 and 12 and say, well, are they real sisters, or are they just kind of some sort of metaphorical sister, or are they cousins? We just take the text at face value. The only reason there's an issue when it comes to the brothers and sisters of Jesus is because of these later theological factors and those concerns that we have with it. So on a face level reading of the text, we would genuinely assume that these must be blood brothers and sisters. And there I might have wanted to leave it, except for just one thing which gives me pause. There's always a little something, isn't there, which gives one pause. And the thing here that makes me wonder, well, it's really a couple of things. Could it be, just could it be, that these brothers and sisters of Jesus are children of Joseph by a previous marriage? Well, there are a couple of reasons why this may be a realistic option. The first one is this text, the Protevangelium of James. Now, in an older episode of the NT Pod, I did talk about the Protevangelium of James. It's a 2nd century text. It's a sort of prequel to the Gospels. And nobody really seriously thinks that it's anything other than almost entirely a work of fiction. But there's just the possibility that it has a couple of historical nuggets in there. And one of the things is that in that text, the brothers of Jesus, and particularly James, are depicted as sons of Joseph from a previous marriage. So Joseph is depicted as an older man, as a widow, who is joined to Mary, and he already brings with him his sons to this marriage. Now, the problem with it, like I said, is that it's a later text. It's almost all clearly fictional, and therefore we can't do a great deal with it. But it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that it has just a little historical nugget in there. Maybe it's taking for granted what lots of people in the 2nd century assumed, which is that Jesus's brothers, so-called, were actually brothers who were sons of Joseph from a previous marriage. Again, I suppose we wouldn't really give much attention to that. if it weren't for the fact that there's a little bit of circumstantial evidence which might just point to the possibility that these are sons of Joseph by a previous marriage. And this is how it stacks up. There are several bits of circumstantial evidence that are worth thinking about. First one of these is, where has Joseph gone in Jesus' mission? The last we actually hear of Joseph in the Gospels is in Luke chapter 2 when Jesus is 12 years old. Otherwise, he's completely absent from the scene in Jesus' adult life. The best bet, therefore, is that Joseph has died by this point. So he's gone, he's out of the picture. But on the other hand, Mary is still present. Jesus' mother is still present in various different places in Jesus' mission, but most notably in the crucifixion narrative in John, and at the beginning of Acts of the Apostles, Acts chapter 1, she's depicted, and she may also be present in Mark 15, depending on how you read Mark 15:40. But she's nevertheless definitely still around. Now, circumstantially, that might actually lend plausibility to the idea that Joseph was a much older man when he married Mary, and that Mary was a young girl, so that, let's say for the sake of argument, that in 4 BCE or so, she was a teenager. This means that by the time of Jesus' adult life, when he's sort of 30 plus, then Mary is already into her kind of late 40s, which sounds kind of plausible for this. For this. And then you have to throw this in as well. If she has given birth to Jesus, and the 4 brothers who are actually known of when Jesus is in Nazareth, that's James, Joseph, Judas and Simon, that's already 5 sons. Then there are mentioned plural sisters. We don't know exactly how many. Matthew actually refers to all the sisters, which means that it could be more than 2. So let's say we've got 2 or 3 sisters as well. We're talking about at least 8 or so children who are mentioned during Jesus' adulthood, never mind any that had died earlier on. Now, it's not impossible that Mary had given birth to all of those kids, 7 or 8 children who had survived into Jesus' adulthood. But it becomes just increasingly just a little less likely with each one, given the very high incidences of women dying in childbirth in antiquity. It's one of the most sort of appalling things when you think about antiquity, and frankly, not just antiquity, but until relatively recent times, the number of women who died in childbirth, or even that died subsequently to that, and that children that died. I mean, it's a very different kind of picture we're looking at. So the fact that Mary is still alive when Jesus dies, the fact that there are several brothers and sisters mentioned as well, it could be that she's given birth to all of these people. But we have to say that it just might be, that tradition, that these, at least some of them, are children of Joseph from a previous marriage, well, it's something I would at least want to keep the options open on. It's quite possible that something is going on there that's of relevance. Before we finish, is there anything else we can say about the brothers of Jesus? Sadly, can't say a lot about the sisters because I don't think we know their names. But is there anything we can say about the brothers? Well, the names are interesting. James, Joseph, Judas, Simon. And then throw in Jesus' name as well, which is Joshua, Jesus. They're all very strong Old Testament Hebrew Bible names. They're the names of patriarchs. They're the names of people like Judah, Simeon, Joseph. I mean, these are really important names. It's also interesting that in at least 2 of the cases, they're the names of 2 of the Maccabean martyrs. We've got Judas and Simeon, Simon. So that's curious as well. Could it be that the people who named these sons, whether Mary and Joseph, whether Joseph and whoever else, could it be that they really show their utter loyalty to their Jewish faith and inheritance, that they look back to that inheritance, that they're hoping that perhaps one of their sons might be the one to redeem Israel? Does it just hint that there's something there, just something in the family of Jesus that right back there was hoping that one of their kids might be the one who becomes the saviour of that nation? I don't know though, it might just be that they're common names. We know what names are like, both in antiquity and in the present, and what happens is certain names hang around, certain people name their sons, and their daughters according to conventions and all the rest of it. But nevertheless, it might just be telling, it might just be slightly interesting. I joked with my class the other day that it's a little bit like the idea that every American parent wants their kid to become the president of the United States, and they tell them that they might be president of the United States. And I joke with the class, well, maybe Mary and Joseph, in naming their children things like Jesus, Joshua, Joseph, Judas, Simon, maybe what they were doing was hoping that they would be the one to play a key role in the restoration of Israel. Just maybe that's what they said. Maybe that's how they brought them up. Maybe they said, you could be the one who is decisive in redeeming Israel. Who knows? Well, thanks for listening to the latest episode of the NT Pod. It's yet another of the snowcast. I hope it's the last snowcast of the year, because it's really playing havoc with my attempts to run a normal class. But it's good to have your company on this podcast, as well as having the company of my class to listen to it. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com. I've got a Facebook page and a Twitter account. Look at NT Pod for both of those. And of course, you can find me on iTunes or Duke University's iTunes U. Hope to be along again soon with another episode. In the meantime, thanks again, and bye-bye.